There are wars that stay on maps, and there are wars that travel. They travel through shipping contracts, insurance premiums, radar screens, refinery schedules, and fuel pumps. They travel through destroyer combat systems and the daily prices that ordinary drivers see on the edge of a highway. The Strait of Hormuz is where a regional crisis stops being regional, because it is the place where military pressure and commercial dependence are packed into one narrow corridor of water. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles across. That sounds small enough to fit comfortably inside a map graphic. But maps hide what that width means in practice. It means oil tankers, LNG carriers, escorts, patrol aircraft, drones, missiles, and coastal launch sites all operating inside a space where a local threat can become a global problem with very little warning. It means that one body of water can become the meeting point for Iranian coercion, U.S. maritime protection, Israeli regional war pressure, and the expectations of energy markets that react long before any official closure is announced. The first fact is scale. In 2024, roughly 20 million barrels per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz. That is about 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. The same passage also carried about 1/5 of global LNG trade and more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade. Those are not secondary numbers. They mean that the strait is not simply important to nearby states. It is important to the industrial routines of countries thousands of miles away, to shipping firms that never see the Gulf directly, and to central banks and finance ministries that know what an energy shock can do to inflation. The second fact is that this is not only a hypothetical fear. By spring 2026, the strait had already become a live collision point. On April 13, 2026, U.S. forces began implementing a blockade against maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports, while saying that non-Iranian traffic moving through Hormuz would not be impeded. On May 4, 2026, the United States said its forces were supporting what CENTCOM called Project Freedom to restore freedom of navigation through the strait. On May 7, 2026, CENTCOM said U.S. warships transiting Hormuz were targeted by missiles, drones, and small boats. Late in May, U.S. forces intercepted drones threatening areas in and near the strait, and then struck Iranian radar and drone command and control sites in Goruk and on Kashem Island. The third fact is that markets do not wait for a clean legal announcement that a sea route is closed. They react to danger, backlog, hesitation, and uncertainty. The Energy Information Administration linked the first quarter oil price surge of 2026 to the military escalation that followed February 28 and described a de facto closure of the strait. It later reported that Middle East crude tanker rates in March hit their highest level in the series going back to November 2005. That is how these crises spread. A missile launch does not need to sink every tanker. It only needs to convince enough operators, insurers, charterers, and governments that routine passage is no longer routine. That is why the Strait of Hormuz is more than a Gulf story. It is a story about the architecture of world energy, the burden of keeping sea lanes open, the difficulty of containing a regional war once it begins to touch shipping, and the problem Washington faces when its military presence, alliance commitments, and economic interests all converge in the same narrow place. America may not want a wider war in the Middle East, but when the waterway that carries so much of the world's traded oil becomes a battleground of coercion and escort, the United States does not get to think about the crisis only as a distant political argument. It has to think about ships, air defense, market stability, and the question every deployment planner dreads. What happens if this gets worse? To understand why this one passage matters so much, it helps to begin with geography, stripped of drama. The strait is the maritime exit from the Persian Gulf. Every producer and exporter inside that basin lives with a simple physical reality. If cargo leaves Gulf terminals by sea, it must eventually pass through Hormuz unless it can be diverted to one of the limited pipeline routes that bypass the chokepoint. That is what makes the strait so different from an ordinary shipping lane. It is not just busy. It is structurally necessary. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iran all sit inside a broader regional system whose commercial seaborne flows depend on that exit. Some of those states are political rivals. Some are U.S. partners. Some are targets or actors inside the current crisis. But the geometry does not care about diplomacy. It forces the same question on everyone. How do you get energy out of the Gulf when the one gateway to the open ocean becomes threatened? That is why the EIA's baseline numbers matter so much. They tell us that Hormuz is not merely one important route among many. It is one of the central valves of the global energy system. Around 1/5 of the world's petroleum liquids consumption depends on it in normal conditions. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade passes through it as well. More than 1/4 of seaborne oil trade moves through that same corridor. If a war planner wanted to identify a place where naval tension could produce immediate economic leverage, this would be near the top of the list. Much of that flow goes to Asia, which is another reason the strait matters beyond the Middle East itself. A chokepoint crisis in Hormuz is not simply about whether U.S. consumers import most of their own crude from the Gulf. That is not how world oil pricing works. Oil is globally traded, benchmarks are internationally priced, and shipping disruptions influence everyone even when the molecule burned in one country was not loaded in the Gulf. China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other Asian importers care because they depend on those flows more directly. Europe cares because a supply shock tightens the broader market and raises competition for alternatives. The United States cares because it lives inside the same pricing system, the same alliance system, and the same financial system that absorbs the damage when one of the world's key maritime exits becomes unstable. There is another misunderstanding that often appears in public debate. People assume a big producer like the United States should be insulated from a Gulf crisis because it pumps a lot of oil at home. But domestic production does not create a sealed national market. American consumers still buy fuel priced in a world market. U.S. airlines still buy jet fuel, trucking companies still buy diesel, chemical plants still buy feedstocks, and financial expectations still move with global benchmarks. If a shock pushes crude higher, shipping higher, and inventories lower, those effects show up in the United States whether or not the barrel itself started on the Gulf Coast of Texas or in a terminal farther east. That is also why LNG matters. The strait is not only an oil artery, it is a major route for natural gas carried in liquefied form. For importers that rely on LNG cargoes, especially in Asia, the security of the strait is tied to electricity systems, industrial demand, and winter storage decisions. A crisis in Hormuz therefore becomes a broader fuel security problem, not just a crude oil problem. It affects how countries hedge, how traders price seasonal demand, and how much policymakers worry about secondary shocks in power and manufacturing. The obvious answer is bypass. If the route is so risky, why not simply move the energy another way? The short answer is that there are bypass options, but not enough. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates do have pipeline infrastructure that can move some volumes around the strait. But the EIA is explicit that this capacity is limited. It cannot fully replace the normal volume that moves through Hormuz. In a real disruption, pipelines help, but they do not solve the problem. They reduce some exposure. They do not eliminate it. That limitation matters for two reasons. First, it means that every military planner and every market participant understands there is no easy reroute for the full scale of normal trade. Second, it gives coercive power to any actor capable of threatening the route, even if that actor cannot permanently close it. If you know the bypass is partial, then you know any sustained disruption will force difficult choices somewhere else. Exporters will have to ration throughput. Importers will have to compete harder for replacement barrels. Insurers will demand more compensation for risk, and warships will be asked to hold open a corridor that no pipeline system can fully replace. The strait therefore sits at the intersection of logistics and psychology. The logistics are obvious. Huge volumes have to move through it. The psychology is just as important. Everyone knows those huge volumes have to move through it. That shared knowledge changes behavior. It makes governments more sensitive, traders more nervous, insurers more demanding, and navies more alert. In some crises, coercion comes from actual destruction. In Hormuz, coercion can come from expectation. The fear that a route may become unusable can begin moving prices and deployments before the route is completely unusable. This is why Hormuz continues to matter even in a world with more diversified supply than in earlier decades. The choke point remains critical because the traded market still depends on maritime movement at scale. Oil is not just produced, it has to be moved, insured, financed, refined, and delivered. If the movement stage becomes dangerous, the rest of the chain starts to tighten. That is why the World Bank, the IMF, the IEA, and the WTO all had reason to worry in spring 2026. They were not reacting to abstract strategy. They were reacting to the vulnerability of a system whose efficiency depends on narrow routes staying usable. It is worth slowing down here, because the phrase critical oil choke point can sound like jargon until it is translated into ordinary practice. Every day, cargoes moving through Hormuz are tied to loading windows, tanker schedules, refinery demand, financing arrangements, and contractual obligations that were built on the assumption of reasonably reliable passage. A choke point is not only a narrow map feature, it is a place where the timing discipline of global trade becomes unusually fragile. If the route slows, backs up, or becomes erratic, the damage is felt not only by whoever was nearest the incident, it is felt across the whole chain that assumed the route would remain predictable. That chain begins on the export side. Gulf producers do not ship abstract barrels. They ship volumes already matched to buyers, delivery programs, and revenue expectations. A delay matters because it changes cash flow, storage pressure, and the credibility of future commitments. A producer that can no longer trust normal maritime outflow is forced to think about allocation, prioritization, and rerouting. That in turn changes how buyers view the security of supply. Even when volume is still moving, the confidence that the system is functioning smoothly begins to weaken. The chain then extends into the tanker market itself. Tanker availability is not infinite, and tanker schedules are not perfectly elastic. If vessels begin to bunch, if war risk clauses change, if crews or owners become more cautious, and if some transits take longer or require additional protective arrangements, then the whole fleet feels tighter. A vessel delayed in the Gulf can affect loading opportunities elsewhere because maritime transport systems are linked by timing. A choke point crisis therefore operates partly through congestion. It does not need perfect denial to become economically painful. It only needs enough disruption to make normal scheduling less normal. The importance of LNG reinforces the same point in a different sector. Liquefied natural gas is not simply another hydrocarbon trade. It is deeply connected to power generation, industrial planning, and seasonal demand management. For buyers that depend on LNG cargoes, uncertainty is itself a cost. Utilities do not like wondering whether fuel will arrive on time in a tense market. Industrial firms do not like planning around delivery assumptions that suddenly feel political and military, rather than commercial. When 1/5 of global LNG trade is routed through a threatened choke point, the consequences spread beyond oil pricing into the broader question of fuel security. This is why partial workarounds do not change the underlying strategic fact. Pipelines can help, but pipelines do not recreate the flexibility of normal sea movement at full scale. A pipeline bypass can absorb some volume and reduce panic at the margin. It cannot transform Hormuz into a secondary concern. In some ways, partial bypass can even sharpen the market's sense of exposure because it clarifies exactly how much of the flow remains trapped by the strait. The market then prices not complete helplessness, but a quantifiable remainder of vulnerability. That is still vulnerability. Consider what that means for Asian importers. For many of them, Gulf cargoes are not marginal supply. They are part of the structural fuel picture. If Hormuz becomes unreliable, those states cannot simply shrug and rely on local convenience. They must compete harder for alternatives, draw inventories faster, or accept greater cost. And because several large importers would be looking for alternatives at once, the price effect can become self-reinforcing. This is another way choke point crises spread, not by literal universal shortage on day one, but by synchronized demand for replacement confidence. The same applies to Europe, even if the composition of fuel dependence differs. Europe does not need to be directly dependent on every Gulf cargo for Hormuz to matter. It only needs to live inside a market where tighter supply and higher transport costs spread across pricing benchmarks. substitute cargoes, and industrial expectations. An energy shock in a globally traded system is rarely neat. It reaches by substitution and competition as much as by direct dependency. If Asian buyers bid more aggressively for alternatives because Gulf flows look risky, Europe feels it. If tanker rates surge, Europe feels it. If refined product markets tighten because crude movement becomes harder, Europe feels it. The United States then encounters a different but equally important version of the same reality. It is true that America is less directly dependent on Gulf imports than in earlier eras, but that fact can mislead if it is treated as strategic insulation. The United States still lives inside a world pricing system for oil and fuel. American producers, refiners, airlines, logistics firms, and consumers all experience the consequences of global benchmark moves. The question is not whether the United States can replace every Gulf barrel inside its own territory. The question is whether it can escape the pricing, alliance, and market consequences of Gulf instability. It cannot. This is why Washington's stake in Hormuz is broader than import arithmetic. It is about credibility, allied resilience, financial stability, and the expectation that the U.S. Navy remains the main maritime force capable of defending access through a crisis. If the route becomes chronically dangerous, the damage is not limited to fuel cost alone. It affects how allies judge American staying power, how markets judge U.S. control of strategic sea lanes, and how adversaries judge the price Washington will pay to preserve international commerce. A choke point crisis therefore becomes a test not only of maritime security, but of geopolitical authority. There is also a temporal dimension that deserves more attention. A route like Hormuz can function as a crisis accelerant because it compresses the delay between military danger and economic effect. Some foreign policy problems take a long time to reach ordinary life. Hormuz does not. Oil benchmarks can move quickly. Tanker rates can move quickly. Inventory strategies can change quickly. And the public can start feeling the consequences before policymakers have time to settle on a coherent, long-term answer. That speed gives the choke point political power. It forces governments to react under time pressure instead of planning under calm conditions. The result is that Hormuz is not merely a route to watch in wartime. It is a route whose peacetime credibility has to be defended continuously once a crisis begins. A state that wants leverage does not need to close it forever. It only needs to make the route feel exposed enough that every participant starts making defensive adjustments. In that sense, the Strait is both a physical corridor and a confidence machine. When it works, global trade benefits quietly. When it fails, the consequences are transmitted through prices, policy, and military posture with unusual speed. There is another way to see the same problem. In a normal sea lane, delay can often be absorbed because ships can space out, reroute, or arrive through several alternative corridors. In Hormuz, the concentration is part of the crisis. Too much volume depends on too little room. That means the issue is not only whether a tanker can physically pass on one given day. The issue is whether the whole line of tankers, charterers, terminals, and buyers behind it still believes passage will remain broadly dependable over the next week, the next month, and the next quarter. That is why bypass capacity matters and still does not solve the problem. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates do have routes that can move some volume around the choke point. But the EIA's point is that the bypass remains partial. A partial bypass changes the severity of the shock. It does not erase the leverage created by the route itself. Markets understand that. Exporters understand that. Importers understand that. And once everyone understands that, the choke point keeps its power even before a complete disruption occurs. This is also why states far from the Gulf monitor Hormuz so closely. A government in East Asia is not asking only whether one cargo arrives, it is asking whether a whole fuel system remains predictable. A government in Europe is asking whether tighter Gulf flows will raise competition for alternative cargoes and put more inflationary pressure on economies already sensitive to energy costs. Washington asks a broader question still. If a Gulf disruption hits allies, shipping, inflation, and force posture at the same time, can the United States treat the crisis as merely regional? In practice, it cannot. The strait also matters because it converts military events into civilian consequences with remarkable speed. A political crisis elsewhere might take months to filter into ordinary life. A crisis in Hormuz can start moving crude benchmarks, tanker rates, and insurance costs almost immediately. That means the American consumer, the Indian refiner, the Japanese utility buyer, the European chemical producer, and the Gulf exporter are all linked to the same patch of water, even if they never think about it directly. Very few places in international politics create that kind of fast transmission from missile risk to grocery bills and inflation forecasts. Once that physical dependence is clear, Iran's strategy makes more sense. Tehran does not need to imagine some perfect dramatic closure in order to gain leverage. It needs to understand what the strait already is. A place where limited pressure can have outsized consequences because everyone knows the route cannot be fully replaced. That is the basic logic of coercion in Hormuz. You do not need to stop every ship. You need to make passage feel uncertain enough that security costs rise, commercial behavior changes, and rival governments are forced to respond. That is why a neat phrase like "shut down the strait" can be misleading. It sounds as if there are only two states, open and closed. The real world is messier. There are degrees of pressure, degrees of hesitation, and degrees of degraded confidence. Iran can exploit that gray area. Coastal launch sites, drones, missiles, maritime harassment, and the threat of repeated attacks do not need to create a formal barrier across the water. They only need to produce enough friction that the route stops feeling routine. Military and market history both teach the same lesson here. Shipping is not just about whether a tanker physically can sail from one point to another. It is about whether the crew will accept the risk, whether the owner can ensure the transit, whether the charterer can tolerate delay, whether the naval situation is clear enough to trust an escort, and whether multiple incidents begin to suggest a pattern rather than a one-off danger. In a major choke point, perception can be operationally decisive. Iran's pressure strategy takes advantage of that. A threat can come from the coast. It can come from an unmanned system. It can come from a missile battery, a radar network, a fast boat, or the possibility that a vessel will be challenged in ways that are hard to predict and expensive to counter. The important point is not simply the individual weapon, it is the layering. The more possible threat directions there are, the more complicated route protection becomes. Commercial movement does not stop because one weapon is unbeatable. It slows and grows more expensive because many different threats have to be priced and defended against at once. This is exactly why late May 2026 mattered. CENTCOM said U.S. forces intercepted 5 one-way attack drones threatening areas in and near the Strait of Hormuz and prevented a 6th launch from Bandar Abbas. A few days later, CENTCOM said it conducted self-defense strikes on Iranian radar and drone command and control sites in Gorak and on Keshem Island. Those details matter because they show the mechanics of pressure. The danger did not exist as a vague theory. It existed in launch points, control nodes, and attempted attacks aimed at threatening ships transiting regional waters. Gorak and Keshem are not famous names for most viewers, but that is precisely why they matter in a naval documentary. A maritime crisis is rarely driven only by the visible ships at sea. It is driven by the land-based systems that watch them, cue against them, threaten them, and create the conditions under which commercial captains begin to doubt whether a normal passage is really normal anymore. The coastline facing Hormuz is not background. It is part of the weapons architecture of the crisis. The same is true of drones. They have changed the cost equation of regional conflict because they allow pressure to be applied more cheaply and more persistently than many older systems. A drone does not have to guarantee a kill to create strategic burden. It can force a defensive response. It can trigger an intercept. It can keep watchstanders alert for hours. It can create ambiguity in crowded air and sea space. It can contribute to a pattern that insurers and traders start treating as structurally dangerous rather than episodically dangerous. This is one reason why Iran does not need to seek a cinematic all-at-once closure. A fully declared closure would be politically clear, militarily escalatory, and easier for adversaries to describe as a direct challenge requiring major response. Pressure below that threshold can sometimes achieve more. It can wear down nerves, move prices, and complicate naval protection without forcing every actor to acknowledge that a formal new war phase has begun. Ambiguity can be useful when the goal is leverage rather than immediate total denial. That ambiguity is most effective when it is combined with repetition. One isolated threat may be dismissed as part of the background noise of the region. Repeated drone launches, repeated radar tracking, repeated warnings, repeated escort burdens, and repeated public statements about threats to transiting vessels create a different atmosphere. They teach the market that the danger is persistent. They teach commercial actors that higher costs are not temporary anomalies. And they teach navies that the burden of presence is not a short demonstration, but a continuing mission. The logic extends beyond physical attack. A maritime threat is also a threat to time. A tanker delayed is still a strategic event if enough cargoes are delayed at once. A vessel backlog, inspection burden, rerouting decision, or prolonged caution from shipping firms can push up rates and feed the same economic pressure that a kinetic attack would have created more dramatically. That is why tanker rates matter so much in this story. They are one of the clearest signals that coercion is already affecting behavior. The EIA's March 2026 tanker rate report captured this well. Rates for Middle East crude tankers surged to a multi-decade high, driven by closure risk, vessel backlog, and war risk insurance pressure. Those are commercial words, but they describe military success of a sort. If a threatened choke point becomes meaningfully more expensive to traverse, then whoever generated the threat has already changed the system. The route may still be open on paper, but it is no longer functioning with normal confidence. Notice how little of this requires a total battlefield victory. Iran does not need to prove it can permanently seal the Gulf shut. It only needs to prove that it can make the cost of open passage uncomfortably high, and the risk of complacency politically unacceptable. That is the essence of pressure strategy in a choke point. It is a campaign of insurance, delay, threat saturation, and selective confrontation designed to turn geography into leverage. That also explains why navies talk so often about freedom of navigation rather than just traffic volume. In a place like Hormuz, freedom of navigation is not a symbolic phrase. It means commercial actors believe they can move without being forced into a wartime operating model. The moment shipping begins to depend on constant military protection, emergency insurance pricing, and daily threat bulletins, freedom is already under strain even if the waterway is not fully sealed. Iran understands that the burden falls on its adversaries. Coastal positions are cheaper to sustain than permanent escort operations. Attack systems can be cheaper than the defenses they provoke. A state willing to live with more ambiguity and volatility may gain leverage over states that depend on predictability. In that sense, the pressure strategy is not merely military. It is political economy by other means. It uses the market's preference for certainty as a target. That preference for certainty is exactly what makes coercion below the threshold of formal closure so useful. Shipping companies, insurers, and traders are not paid to prove bravery. They are paid to move cargo at tolerable cost. If the route begins to require emergency attention, elevated insurance, and constant military updates, then it has already become less attractive even if it is technically still open. That is why a strategy based on repeated threat can be so effective. It transforms an ordinary transit into an exceptional one. There is also a signaling advantage in partial disruption. A formally declared closure would unify opponents more easily and clarify responsibility. Repeated threat activity, attempted launches, and rising transit costs can create almost as much pressure while preserving more room for ambiguity. In that gray zone, governments may disagree about response. Commercial actors may retreat faster than navies do, and the actor creating the pressure can observe how much cost its opponents are willing to absorb before changing course. Hormuz is an ideal environment for that kind of pressure campaign, because the commercial consequences appear quickly. And this is where the story shifts toward the U.S. Navy, because once a choke point becomes a coercive space rather than a neutral transit lane, someone has to bear the cost of keeping movement credible. For Washington, that means translating broad national objectives into repetitive maritime work, surveillance, escorts, warnings, air defense, boarding authority, route confidence, and the ability to say not only that ships may pass, but that they can pass often enough and safely enough for commerce to keep functioning. That is a very different mission from winning one set-piece naval battle. It is a campaign of endurance, vigilance, and expensive reassurance. The U.S. mission in this crisis is often misunderstood because two separate functions are happening at once. One is coercive toward Iran, the other is protective toward everyone else. On April 12, 2026, CENTCOM announced that U.S. forces would blockade ships entering or exiting Iranian ports beginning April 13, while explicitly stating that non-Iranian traffic transiting the Strait of Hormuz would not be impeded. In other words, Washington was not trying to close the route to general commerce. It was trying to isolate Iranian maritime access while preserving the wider shipping lane. That distinction matters because blockade and freedom of navigation can sound contradictory if they are described lazily. They are not contradictory here. They are parts of the same operational picture. The United States was attempting to constrain Iranian port traffic while also preventing the broader choke point from collapsing into a general commercial shutdown. One part of the mission says no to one class of maritime movement. The other part says yes to everyone else, but only if that yes can be made credible under threat. Project Freedom is the most direct official label for that second task. On May 3, 2026, CENTCOM said U.S. forces would support the launch of Project Freedom to restore freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. It described a posture that included guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and 15,000 service members. That is not the footprint of a symbolic patrol. It is the footprint of a major maritime security operation built around persistent presence, detection, response, and the ability to absorb repeated demands over time. A destroyer escort in this environment is doing more than physically accompany a ship from one coordinate to another. It is providing radar coverage, missile defense, command and control, communication relay, and confidence. It is a visible statement that the route is being actively protected, but that visibility comes at a cost. Every escort mission ties up warships, crews, sensors, aircraft support, intelligence cycles, maintenance schedules, and logistic planning. A choke point under pressure turns even simple movement into a systems problem. The May 7 transit incident illustrates the burden clearly. CENTCOM said USS Truxtun, USS Rafael Peralta, and USS Mason were targeted during a Strait of Hormuz transit by missiles, drones, and small boats. That combination is important. It shows that the threat was not one-dimensional. A warship moving through the strait had to worry about air attack, maritime harassment, and the possibility of layered pressure at the same time. For sailors on those ships, this is not abstract geopolitics. It is watch standing, radar interpretation, threat discrimination, weapons readiness, and the knowledge that a commercial transit lane can become a combat environment very quickly. That is why keeping the sea lane open is not simply a matter of sending a few gray hulls into the Gulf. Warships have to maintain enough situational awareness to separate normal commercial clutter from genuine threat behavior. Aircraft have to extend the sensor picture. Intelligence systems have to track launches, coastal sites, and communication patterns. Unmanned platforms can help widen the surveillance field. Boarding forces may be needed for maritime enforcement, and if the threat includes mines or persistent attack risk, specialized mine countermeasure capacity becomes relevant as well. Even when those capabilities are not all visible on one day, they belong to the same mission set. One of the hardest parts of maritime protection is that success often looks uneventful. If tankers move, insurance panic eases, and the market believes the route remains usable, the naval work can appear invisible. But invisibility is not the same as ease. It means the burden has been absorbed by ships and crews operating at a pace designed to prevent a larger breakdown. The public sees the absence of catastrophe. The Navy sees long watches, intercept calculations, coordination with aircraft, risk to ships on transit, and the constant question of how long such a posture can be sustained before it starts affecting readiness somewhere else. This is also where manpower matters. 15,000 service members, as CENTCOM described in the Project Freedom context, is a reminder that maritime security is not one ship and one commander. It is a network of people across decks, bridges, combat information centers, maintenance shops, intelligence cells, flight crews, communications nodes, and staffs that translate broad policy into hourly operational decisions. Commercial viewers often imagine that a warship is a self-contained answer to a sea lane problem. In reality, every protected transit depends on a much wider ecosystem. The burden is amplified by the fact that Hormuz is not a remote, empty ocean. It is crowded water close to shore, politically charged, and full of commercial movement. That makes every tactical decision more difficult. A destroyer cannot treat every radar contact as hostile. It must sort, identify, and respond within a mixed environment where civilian and military signatures can overlap. A drone defense problem in open ocean is already challenging. A drone defense problem near a busy choke point with nearby coastlines and commercial traffic is far more demanding. This is why escort missions become sensor-intensive, and why freedom of navigation operations in contested environments are never just about seamanship. They are about battle management. Which contact matters? Which track is climbing into the threat picture? Which small boat is routine and which is not? Which radar behavior suggests queuing for an attack? Which commercial vessel needs reassurance? Which unit is responsible for which slice of the defensive envelope? That is the daily grammar of a naval mission that must look calm from the outside even when it is tactically tense on the inside. There is a broader strategic reason the United States accepts this burden. If Washington allows a choke point like Hormuz to become effectively unusable, it is not just losing control of a local corridor. It is conceding that a regional actor can rewrite the terms of global commerce through pressure at sea. That would affect U.S. credibility with partners, the confidence of commercial shipping, and the wider belief that the U.S. Navy can still guarantee basic access through one of the world's central energy routes. For a maritime power, that kind of concession is costly even if no formal war declaration follows. But the burden also creates a trap. The more the United States commits to protecting the route, the more exposed its ships and forces become to the very escalation it is trying to contain. Escorts create targets. Persistent presence creates wear. Intercepts consume readiness. Strikes against launch infrastructure create political repercussions. Maritime security operations designed to prevent a wider war can therefore become stepping stones toward deeper involvement if the threat continues to grow. Hormuz is a place where restraint and escalation are often separated by only a few incidents. That is why April and May 2026 matter so much. They showed the United States already performing the classic functions of a power that cannot ignore the route, enforcing maritime pressure on Iran, protecting non-Iranian transit, assigning major force packages to regional navigation security, and responding kinetically when drone and radar networks threaten ships at sea. The question is no longer whether Washington cares about Hormuz. The question is how much further the crisis can stretch that commitment before an escort mission becomes something larger. To understand how large the commitment already is, it helps to think about routine rather than headline. A protected route requires more than a destroyer near a tanker. It requires tracking which ships are transiting, what the air picture looks like, which coastal systems are active, what intelligence says about launch activity, what rules of engagement apply, and how long ships and aircraft can sustain the pace. A choke point crisis is therefore not solved by one dramatic deployment. It is managed through repetition, and repetition is what makes the mission expensive. That repetition creates a sustainability problem. Crews fatigue. Ships need maintenance. Aircraft need turnaround. Intercepts consume readiness even when they are tactically successful. If the route remains dangerous for long enough, then the mission starts to compete with other global naval demands. In other words, the price of keeping Hormuz credible is not paid only in the Gulf. It is also paid in the opportunity cost of what those same ships, aircraft, and crews cannot be doing elsewhere. And yet Hormuz cannot be understood only through the lens of ships and oil. The wider regional war keeps refilling the crisis with political energy. That is where Gaza enters the story, not as the title and not as a separate documentary pretending to be unrelated, but as one of the major war fronts shaping the atmosphere in which the strait is being contested. Gaza matters because it is the part of the regional crisis that keeps emotions high, diplomacy unstable, and escalation incentives alive across multiple theaters at once. By late May 2026, reporting said Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had directed Israeli forces toward much wider control inside Gaza, with coverage describing a move toward roughly 70% control. Whether or not that exact figure remains stable day to day is less important than what it signals. It signals that the Gaza war was not quietly winding down. It was still expanding in territorial and political terms. That matters because a war that remains active in Gaza continues to shape Iranian rhetoric, proxy calculations, Arab state diplomacy, and U.S. regional force posture. For Iran and the groups aligned with it, Gaza is not merely one battlefield. It is the moral and political core of the current regional narrative. Pressure against Israel, pressure against U.S. presence, pressure on Red Sea and Gulf shipping, and pressure through allied armed groups all become easier to justify domestically and regionally when Gaza remains an active and highly visible war. That does not mean every move in Hormuz is a direct extension of battlefield decisions in Gaza. It means Gaza keeps the broader escalation ecosystem alive. This matters for Washington because the United States is trying to do several difficult things at once. It is trying to support Israel politically and militarily. It is trying to prevent that support from becoming an uncontrollable regional chain reaction. It is trying to protect U.S. forces and shipping, and it is trying to keep global markets from treating the entire Middle East as one widening war zone. Gaza complicates all of those tasks because it constantly re-injects urgency, outrage, and retaliation into the regional system. From a naval perspective, Gaza matters because it changes the meaning of every deployment. A destroyer in or near the region is not only there for abstract presence, it is part of a larger posture shaped by Israeli operations, Iranian signaling, proxy responses, and U.S. court efforts to reassure partners while deterring attacks. That means the naval mission around Hormuz exists inside a war environment whose emotional and political center may be somewhere else, but whose military consequences are spread across sea lanes, airspace, and bases. It also means that Gaza helps explain why the crisis keeps expanding laterally. A local land campaign would be easier to contain if surrounding actors had little reason to connect themselves to it. But the Gaza war is exactly the kind of conflict that invites linkage. It links militias to states, local grievances to regional strategy, and symbolic politics to real maritime risk. Once that linkage becomes normal, it becomes much harder to describe any single naval incident as isolated. Everything feels connected because, strategically, much of it is. This is another reason the Strait of Hormuz story should not be framed only as an oil story. It is an oil story, but it is also a war system story. The route becomes dangerous not simply because tankers are valuable, but because the wider regional crisis keeps creating new motives for coercion, retaliation, signaling, and pressure. Shipping is where those motives encounter global dependence most visibly. Gaza also matters because it affects U.S. domestic politics, which in turn affects how Washington manages maritime risk. A government facing pressure over Middle East policy at home is not making naval decisions in a vacuum. Every strike, escort mission, or reported confrontation exists inside a broader argument about support for Israel, regional escalation, oil prices, inflation, and the danger of another open-ended American entanglement. In other words, the war in Gaza does not just change the region. It changes the political context in which the United States decides how much risk to accept at sea. There is a tendency in some analysis to treat maritime security as cleaner and more technical than land war, but in this crisis the two are entangled. A land war in Gaza changes regional incentives. Those incentives shape proxy behavior and Iranian posture. That posture helps define the threat environment around Hormuz. And the threat environment around Hormuz then changes oil prices, tanker rates, and the domestic political cost of U.S. policy. The loop is not perfect, and it is not instant, but it is real. That is why a naval briefing room episode on Hormuz cannot simply skip Gaza. The audience would miss the political engine driving the wider conflict. At the same time, Gaza should not be the whole frame, because then the specifically maritime question gets lost. The point is to see the relationship clearly. Gaza is one chapter in the larger regional crisis. Hormuz is one of the points where that crisis becomes impossible for major powers to ignore. The same relationship explains why Lebanon matters so much, even though it sits far from the strait itself. A northern escalation does not change the width of Hormuz or the number of tankers waiting to pass. What it changes is the probability that the whole region is sliding into a broader conflict. Markets respond to that probability. So do navies. If Lebanon worsens while Gaza remains active and shipping remains threatened, then every effort to describe the Gulf crisis as limited becomes harder to sustain. That is why U.S. diplomacy keeps trying to contain the northern front. Washington is not simply chasing ceasefire language for its own sake. It is trying to prevent another active theater from amplifying the same crisis that is already hitting energy routes and force posture. In a multi-front regional conflict, maritime reassurance becomes harder because every new front adds uncertainty, political pressure, and fresh reasons for retaliation elsewhere. If Gaza is the political center of gravity in one sense, Lebanon and Hezbollah are one of the most dangerous escalation hinges in another. The Northern Front matters to Washington because it threatens to turn an already broad regional crisis into a genuinely wider war with more fronts, more missile exchange, more U.S. diplomatic exposure, and more strain on already active U.S. military commitments. A flare-up in Lebanon does not occur in a vacuum. It changes how Israel allocates force, how Iran calculates pressure, and how the United States has to think about deterrence and crisis management. Reporting in early June 2026 captured this fragility well. Axios said U.S. officials were still pushing for a Lebanon ceasefire while Israel considered possible strikes around Beirut, and then reported Hezbollah rejecting ceasefire terms. That is the kind of sequence diplomats fear, because it suggests the existence of a process without the existence of durable agreement. On paper, there is a containment effort. In practice, there is still a pathway to renewed escalation. Why does that matter for Hormuz? Because every widening front increases the chance that maritime pressure becomes part of a broader retaliatory logic rather than a standalone bargaining tactic. If fighting on Israel's northern border expands, Iran and groups aligned with it have more reason to widen pressure elsewhere, including against shipping, U.S. assets, and symbolic targets tied to commerce and force projection. A northern war therefore feeds the same atmosphere of region-wide risk that already makes the Gulf more unstable. Lebanon also matters because it changes the U.S. diplomatic load. Washington is not only trying to manage one war and one sea lane, it is trying to manage multiple linked escalatory tracks at once. That means envoys, commanders, and policymakers are operating under conditions where failure in one arena can quickly affect calculations in another. If Beirut becomes a major crisis, the bandwidth available for steady maritime reassurance narrows. Resources may not move immediately, but attention certainly does. And attention is a strategic asset during multi-theater crises. From a military standpoint, Hezbollah introduces a different kind of pressure than the one visible in Hormuz. The group represents not a chokepoint threat, but a northern escalation threat, with the capacity to drive Israeli response and alter the entire regional temperature. Yet that difference should not hide the connection. A maritime market frightened by Gulf risk does not carefully separate its anxiety into distinct territorial boxes. It responds to the aggregate probability that the region is sliding into something larger. Lebanon raises that probability. There is also a signaling problem here. The more fronts remain active or unstable, the harder it becomes for any side to convince the market and its opponents that escalation will remain bounded. A single maritime clash might be read as containable if everything else is quiet. The same clash looks more dangerous when Gaza is active, Beirut is tense, and ceasefire efforts are visibly failing. The same missile or drone incident at sea therefore carries more meaning because the surrounding political environment is already deteriorating. This is one reason the U.S. government keeps trying to contain a northern escalation, even when the immediate headlines may be elsewhere. It is not only doing so out of concern for Israel and Lebanon themselves. It is doing so because another active front can overwhelm regional crisis management and make every other theater harder to stabilize. That includes shipping lanes. A ceasefire effort that barely holds is still strategically valuable if it prevents additional strain on a system already under pressure. For viewers focused mainly on tankers and destroyers, Lebanon can appear peripheral. In reality, it is part of the same escalation map. The route to Hormuz does not exist outside regional politics. It exists inside them. If Hezbollah rejects terms, if Israeli leaders consider broader strikes, if U.S. officials fail to contain the northern front, then the probability of additional maritime pressure rises, not because geography changes, but because the incentives for signaling, retaliation, and coercion expand. That is the deeper lesson of the regional crisis. No single front is isolated enough to stay local, once enough actors believe their interests are linked. Gaza intensifies political and proxy pressure. Lebanon threatens another front and more missile exchange. Hormuz converts that atmosphere into market risk and naval burden. The United States is trying to keep each piece compartmentalized, but the system keeps pushing in the opposite direction. Nowhere is that pressure more visible than in the rise of drones, missiles, and other relatively cheap systems that impose very expensive requirements. This is one of the core military stories of the Middle East in 2026. Not because traditional warships or air forces have become irrelevant, but because low-cost attack systems can create strategic leverage far beyond their price tag. A destroyer may be vastly more capable than a one-way attack drone. That does not change the fact that the destroyer must still detect, classify, track, and if necessary, kill the drone before it can threaten a ship, a base, or a commercial lane. That defensive burden grows fast. One drone may be easy to dismiss. Several arriving from different directions, possibly mixed with missile threats or confusing small boat activity, create a much harder problem. Defenders have to maintain constant readiness. They have to preserve missile inventories. They have to keep crews sharp over long periods. They have to decide what constitutes a real threat and when to engage. In busy regional traffic, false confidence and false alarms are both dangerous. The May 7 attack on U.S. warships transiting Hormuz showed this layered problem in miniature. CENTCOM described missiles, drones, and small boats aimed at ships moving through the strait. That is the kind of combined pressure that forces a navy to think not in single weapon categories, but in battle management terms. A commander is not simply asking whether a drone can be intercepted. He is asking whether the full tactical picture is under control while a commercial or military transit continues through constrained water. The late May drone interceptions and the May 31 strikes on radar and command nodes reveal the other side of the same equation. Defending at sea often leads to attacking the system on land that makes the sea threat possible. If drones are being launched toward regional shipping, then defense is not only about intercepting the platform in the air, it is also about finding and disabling the launch and control architecture before more attacks occur. That expands the battle space immediately. A shipping security mission becomes a campaign against nodes, sensors, and command links ashore. This is where cheap threats become strategically powerful. They push more expensive actors into broader, more active, and more visible defensive behavior. A navy cannot ignore launch sites once ships are under repeated danger, but once it strikes those sites, the political stakes rise. The attacker may have started with a relatively low-cost instrument. The defender can quickly find itself committed to a larger and more escalatory operational pattern. The economic logic is similar. Even without citing exact interceptor prices, it is clear that a high-end air defense ecosystem is not cheap to maintain. Warships, sensors, aircraft, crews, maintenance, and munitions all cost far more than the simplest attack tools arrayed against them. That does not mean defense is futile. It means defense has to be sustained by states with deep resources and political will. In a prolonged crisis, that asymmetry matters because the actor generating pressure may need only enough capacity to keep the defender spending attention and readiness. Drones also compress the distance between local and strategic effects. A launch near the Gulf Coast can trigger U.S. action, move insurance calculations, and contribute to international headlines within hours. That speed changes politics. Leaders get less time to separate signal from noise. Markets get less time to assume stability. Commanders get less time to reset. Repetition then turns isolated tactical events into a strategic pattern of insecurity. Missiles deepen the same problem because they force navies to think about magazine depth and defended footprint. A destroyer can protect a lot, but not infinitely. It protects most effectively when the threat is bounded, the picture is clear, and the defended assets are manageable. If the threat becomes layered and persistent, every transit turns into a decision about exposure, allocation, and endurance. Protecting one convoy or one warship passage is different from sustaining a regional shield over time. Commercial vessels amplify this difficulty because they are not warships. They are large, economically significant, and often vulnerable. A navy trying to reassure shipping does not merely guard itself. It has to create a protective environment for vessels that cannot see, shoot, or maneuver like military platforms. That widens the gap between the sophistication of the defender and the relative vulnerability of what is being defended. In a chokepoint, that gap becomes a permanent planning problem. There is a psychological effect as well. A few successful interceptions can reassure. But repeated reports of attacks, launches, and threats can still leave shipping firms anxious. Defensive success at the tactical level does not fully erase fear at the commercial level. Companies and insurers ask a different question from admirals. Admirals ask whether the route can be defended. Companies ask whether the route is still worth the risk at a normal price. Those questions overlap, but they are not identical. For the United States, drones and missiles therefore create a dual burden. They demand operational vigilance and they create strategic choice pressure. How many incidents are tolerable before escort missions expand? How much retaliatory strike activity is acceptable before the mission becomes openly warlike? How much risk to commercial movement is acceptable before allies and importers begin to doubt U.S. control? This is how relatively cheap systems pull larger powers into hard decisions. They do not need to destroy the defender outright. They only need to make passivity look too costly. That is why the drone story is so central to the wider Middle East crisis. It is not a side note or a clickbait add-on. It is one of the main ways the region's military balance has changed. Drones, missiles, and coastal systems allow actors without large blue water navies to impose naval consequences. They turn shore-based pressure into maritime burden. And in a choke point as economically sensitive as Hormuz, that burden quickly escapes the military sphere and becomes an economic one. There is an important naval lesson in that. Powerful warships remain essential, but they are built to project control, not to make endless defensive labor feel cheap. The more often they must hold alert against low-cost recurring threats, the more the attacker benefits from the cost imbalance. That does not make the defender weak. It means the defender has to protect not only ships and cargoes, but also its own ability to sustain the mission over time. This is where magazine depth, radar burden, and crew endurance all matter together. A destroyer can win one engagement and still lose efficiency across a long crisis if it is forced to stay in a constant cycle of watchstanding, intercept preparation, and route reassurance. A drone campaign does not need to destroy a navy to challenge it. It only needs to keep that navy busy, visible, and expensive long enough that commercial and political anxiety continue to rise. The economic transmission starts with flow risk, but it does not end there. When the EIA described the first quarter of 2026, it did not talk about a mild market tremor. It described a sharp price increase linked to the military escalation that followed February 28 and to the subsequent de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Brent front-month futures moved from $61 per barrel at the start of 2026 to one at $18 per barrel by the end of the first quarter. That is the kind of move that reorganizes expectations across the entire economy. Start with the tanker itself. If the route looks more dangerous, charterers demand a premium or hesitate to book. Insurers raise war risk charges. Vessel operators demand compensation for the probability of delay, damage, or outright attack. Even ships that continue sailing through the route do not do so under normal assumptions. That is why tanker rates matter. They are the bridge between a military threat and the delivered cost of energy. The EIA's March report showed that very clearly. Middle East crude tanker rates reached their highest level in the series back to November 2005. That rise reflected closure risk, vessel backlog, and war risk insurance. In plain language, the market was saying that moving a tanker through the Gulf had become materially harder and more dangerous than normal. Those extra costs do not disappear. They move downstream. They move first into benchmark pricing and then into refined products, transport bills, industrial planning, and inflation expectations. Refineries paying more for crude or facing uncertain delivery schedules cannot pretend that the shock is local. Airlines, trucking firms, shipping companies, agriculture, chemicals, and manufacturing all feel the pressure as fuel and feedstock costs change. Fertilizer is one of the clearest spillover examples the World Bank warned about, because energy shocks do not only affect gasoline, they affect the whole industrial ecosystem that depends on energy inputs and transport. That is why the World Bank's April 28 warning mattered. It projected a 24% rise in energy prices in 2026 and warned of higher inflation and slower growth tied to the Middle East war. This is the point at which a maritime crisis becomes a macroeconomic one. Central banks notice it, finance ministries notice it, politicians notice it because voters notice it. The choke point is still in the Gulf, but the political consequences are no longer confined there. The joint statement from the IEA, IMF, World Bank, and WTO on May 29 added another layer of concern by warning of record inventory drawdown and rising fuel security risk if flows did not normalize. Inventories are the cushion that allows economies to absorb shocks. When that cushion thins, markets become more sensitive to every new incident. Prices can jump faster because there's less confidence in the ability to ride out another disruption. In that environment, even a smaller attack or delay can have a larger effect than it would in calmer times. This is where the average American enters the story directly. The United States may produce a great deal of energy at home, but American households still live inside a global price structure. If benchmark crude surges, gasoline and diesel pressures rise. If shipping and fuel costs rise, goods movement becomes more expensive. If inflation expectations rise, the political cost falls on the government of the day. Voters do not need to know the names Goruk or Kashim Island for Hormuz to matter to them. They only need to see fuel bills, food prices, freight costs, and another wave of arguments about why everyday life is becoming more expensive. There is also a strategic politics effect. A sustained energy shock narrows the room for patient policy. Governments facing inflation pressure are more likely to seek rapid stabilization, more likely to reassure markets publicly, and more likely to feel dragged deeper into maritime protection, even when they would prefer narrower commitments. The strait therefore affects not just wallets, but state behavior. It creates urgency that can push policymakers toward choices they might avoid in a lower-stakes environment. That urgency matters because energy shocks are politically legible. Voters may not follow the details of CENTCOM statements, tanker insurance structures, or force posture debates, but they do follow the cost of driving, heating, shipping, and buying food. Once a choke point crisis begins to influence those costs, domestic politics become part of the strategic equation. Leaders are then under pressure both to avoid wider war and to prevent the kind of economic instability that makes a distant crisis feel immediate at home. This is one reason the United States cannot separate maritime security from domestic economic management in a crisis like this. If Hormuz remains unstable, the political cost is not confined to the Pentagon or the State Department. It reaches campaign politics, central bank expectations, and public confidence. That does not mean every price increase leads to war. It means choke points compress foreign policy and domestic policy into the same argument faster than many other crises do. Shipping insurance is one of the least visible but most important mechanisms here. It translates threat into administrative cost. A missile launch does not have to hit a tanker if it makes insurers believe that the probability of a hit is now materially higher. Premiums rise, underwriting gets tighter, and cargo movement becomes more selective and expensive. Those changes can happen faster than new military hardware can arrive in theater. That gives coercive strategies a head start. The same logic applies to vessel backlog. If ships bunch up because transit windows feel uncertain or protective arrangements take time, then timing itself becomes part of the cost. Delayed delivery changes refinery planning. Delayed delivery changes inventory management. Delayed delivery can affect futures expectations even before actual physical scarcity appears at the pump. Markets care about timing almost as much as they care about volume. This is why so many policymakers fear chokepoint crises more than the raw number of damaged ships might initially justify. A few incidents in the right place can produce large second-order effects. Hormuz is exactly that kind of place. It turns modest tactical threats into large strategic questions because it sits inside the transport network of a globally priced commodity that almost every sector of modern life depends on. There is also a democracy problem. Energy shocks are politically legible in a way many foreign policy issues are not. Citizens may not follow ceasefire negotiations or understand naval doctrine, but they understand fuel prices and inflation. That means a crisis in Hormuz can become a domestic American issue very quickly. It enters election season debates, congressional arguments, media coverage, and public frustration. Once that happens, leaders can find themselves under pressure both to avoid war and to prevent the economic conditions that make war seem impossible to ignore. This is another reason the United States cannot simply announce that the region should calm down and step away. Too much of the global economy is still connected to this route. Too much U.S. force posture is already in and around the theater. Too many allied economies depend more directly on the flows than Washington does. And too many domestic political costs emerge if the route is allowed to feel chronically insecure. America may not be the only power that cares about Hormuz, but it remains the power most expected to do something when Hormuz becomes dangerous. That expectation has practical consequences before any final escalation threshold is crossed. The moment a route like Hormuz becomes contested, Washington is asked to perform several roles at once. It must reassure allies that the route will not simply be abandoned to intimidation. It must reassure commercial actors that transit still has a protector. It must signal to Iran that pressure will not be cost-free. It must signal to domestic audiences that it is neither asleep nor recklessly eager for a wider war. And it must do all of that while operating forces in a theater where every additional deployment or strike increases the chance of another incident. This is what makes chokepoint security such a difficult category of mission. It is not pure deterrence, because the threats are already active. It is not pure warfighting, because the route is still supposed to function for commerce. It is not pure diplomacy, because ships and aircraft are doing daily tactical work. And it is not pure economic policy, even though the most politically visible consequences may be economic. Hormuz forces all of those logics into the same frame. That is why seemingly limited incidents there can carry disproportionate weight. A prolonged escort regime is a good example. At first glance, escort sounds simple. A powerful navy accompanies commercial movement and deters interference. In practice, a prolonged escort regime is a commitment to visible exposure. It means warships spend more time near the threat. It means more fuel, more maintenance, more coordination, more rules of engagement questions, and more opportunities for adversaries to study defensive patterns. It also means the protecting navy is accepting that the route can no longer be trusted to function on commercial logic alone. Once that shift happens, the crisis has already deepened conceptually, even if the public language stays cautious. There is also a hidden political cost to success. If the U.S. Navy keeps the route sufficiently open, commercial actors and allied states may grow more dependent on that protection rather than less. That is rational. It is exactly what security guarantees are for. But dependence can make it harder for Washington to scale back later. The route begins to function not because the threat disappeared, but because U.S. protection became part of the route's normal operating condition. That may stabilize the market in the short term while increasing the long-term burden on the protecting power. Now consider the alternative. If the United States visibly reduces its role while threats continue, the commercial signal could be severe. Insurers, traders, and partner governments may read restraint as uncertainty about America's willingness to defend the route. That interpretation alone can move prices and alter policy. In this sense, Washington is constrained from both directions. More involvement creates exposure and cost. Less visible involvement creates fear about abandonment and loss of control. Hormuz punishes indecision because both action and restraint are expensive in different ways. The macroeconomic path from instability to domestic politics also deserves more detail. Start with benchmark crude. When benchmark prices rise sharply, the increase does not remain trapped inside commodity exchanges. Refiners adjust. Transport firms adjust. Industrial buyers hedge. Freight operators face higher operating costs. Agricultural sectors that rely on fuel and fertilizer face additional pressure. Retail prices then absorb part of that upstream strain. The public sees the last stage, but the whole chain moved long before the public noticed. That is why governments care so much about the early stages. By the time the voter notices, the problem is already well established upstream. Tanker rates intensify the same process because they add transport costs to price volatility. A barrel that is more expensive to insure and move can affect delivered energy costs even if the crude benchmark itself calms somewhat. That is why the EIA's tanker rate warning matters so much. It tells us that the stress was not merely speculative. It had already entered the physical shipping economy. Once that happens, the shock becomes harder to dismiss as temporary sentiment. Inventory drawdown then removes the sense of cushion. When stocks are falling, policymakers know they have less room to absorb future disruptions. That can lead governments to become more active in public reassurance, more aggressive in diplomatic pressure, and more willing to accept maritime protection burdens they might have resisted in a calmer market. The route therefore shapes policy not only through present damage but through fear of what the next disruption would do to a system already running thinner. This is where the domestic American angle becomes politically decisive. A crisis in Hormuz reaches the United States not merely because Americans care abstractly about Gulf geography, but because energy and freight costs are politically unforgiving. Fuel, shipping, and inflation are the kinds of issues that quickly become mass politics rather than specialist politics. Members of Congress begin asking what the administration is doing. Candidates begin promising stronger action or wiser restraint. Media coverage shifts from foreign affairs framing to household cost framing, and once that happens, the room for slow, technically elegant, crisis management narrows. The alliance angle matters just as much. Asian allies more exposed to Gulf energy flows may expect Washington to preserve route security. European partners may worry about another externally generated energy shock arriving through already strained markets. Gulf partners may expect not only maritime protection but also political clarity about American staying power. These expectations do not always align perfectly, but they all point in the same direction. The United States is unlikely to be granted the luxury of acting as though Hormuz were someone else's problem. This is why the question of deeper involvement is best understood as an accumulation problem rather than a single dramatic decision. One convoy mission does not create an oil war. One strike on a launch site does not by itself create an open-ended regional campaign. One tanker rate spike does not decide U.S. policy, but repeated escort burdens, repeated drone incidents, repeated market anxiety, repeated allied appeals, and repeated public pressure can together create a staircase of commitment. Washington may believe it is taking one limited step at a time. Over months, those limited steps can amount to a much larger strategic position than anyone publicly intended at the beginning. There is a further complication. Crisis management in Hormuz is inseparable from credibility in other maritime theaters. If Washington is seen as unable or unwilling to defend one of the world's central energy routes, that judgment may influence how allies and rivals think about U.S. maritime commitments elsewhere. For a global naval power, reputational effects matter. They do not decide everything, but they shape how much adversaries think can be demanded through pressure and how much allies think can still be trusted under strain. That means the route's significance exceeds the immediate value of the cargo moving through it on any one day. All of this helps explain why even a limited maritime security mission can feel strategically heavy. The protecting power is not only defending the ships in front of it, it is defending the broader assumption that a critical global choke point will not be permanently subordinated to coercion. That assumption has commercial value, allied value, and reputational value. Once it is challenged, the military effort required to restore confidence may extend well beyond the immediate tactical threat, and that is before we reach the most dangerous possibility, which is not simply a higher oil price, but a perception that the regional system is losing its boundaries. If shipping is threatened, Gaza is active, Lebanon is unstable, and U.S. ships are already intercepting drones and striking launch infrastructure. Then each additional incident arrives in a context where everyone is primed to fear the next step. Markets become more nervous, states become more reactive, navies become more exposed. This is how a route that begins as a commercial corridor becomes a strategic center of gravity. Before turning to the final escalation scenarios, it is worth thinking through what a prolonged disruption would actually look like in sequence. It would probably not begin with a sudden emptying of gas stations or a universally recognized announcement that the world had entered an oil war. It would begin with deteriorating confidence. Traders would start pricing not just the present level of danger, but the probability that the next week or month would be worse. Shipping firms would ask whether the route remained worth normal commercial assumptions. Insurers would raise premiums or narrow terms. Governments would begin reviewing stocks and public messaging. The crisis would deepen through the gradual replacement of ordinary confidence with guarded contingency planning. Stage 1 of that process is financial rather than physical. Price moves arrive before true shortage in many cases, because the market is trying to price the possibility of shortage. A refiner that fears future delay may bid more aggressively today. A utility buyer worried about LNG disruption may accept higher prices sooner rather than wait for tighter conditions later. A tanker owner facing greater risk may demand more money to sail. These decisions are rational at the level of each actor, but together they pull the market into a more expensive and more anxious equilibrium. Stage 2 is logistical strain. Once shipping schedules become less certain, the whole chain behind them begins to wobble. Tankers queue differently. Ports prepare for irregular arrivals. Buyers worry about timing rather than just volume. Cargoes that would once have been planned calmly become objects of competition. If several importers begin adjusting in the same direction, the problem compounds. A chokepoint crisis therefore behaves like a force multiplier. It makes everyone more sensitive to the same uncertainty at the same time. Stage 3 is strategic stock management. Governments and firms begin paying closer attention to inventories, and inventories change the psychology of crisis. When stocks are comfortable, the argument for patience is easier to sustain. When drawdown becomes severe or politically visible, the pressure for action rises. That is why the May 29 joint warning about record inventory drawdown matters so much. It suggests a world in which the margin for error is shrinking. In that world, every new incident in Hormuz carries more weight because there is less cushion left to absorb another shock. Stage 4 is domestic transmission. Rising crude, rising tanker rates, and rising war risk premiums eventually become arguments about household costs, inflation, industrial competitiveness, and political management. Americans feel that through fuel, freight, and price expectations. Other countries feel it through even sharper channels if they depend more directly on Gulf energy. At this point, a chokepoint crisis is no longer simply a maritime security issue. It becomes a whole-of-government issue because central banks, finance ministries, energy ministries, and elected leaders all become participants in the same debate. The United States is affected in a distinctive way. Its domestic production base gives it more resilience than many countries, but resilience is not immunity. The United States still buys and sells inside a global system. American crude producers do not live outside benchmark logic. U.S. refiners do not live outside international price shifts. Consumers certainly do not live outside them. If the global price structure is shocked, then America experiences that shock even if the physical molecule reaching one refinery did not pass through Hormuz. This is the key reason why claims that America can simply ignore Gulf disruption because it produces more at home are strategically shallow. There is a military version of the same misunderstanding. Some people assume the U.S. Navy can keep the route open and that this settles the question. But what does keep open actually mean? Does it mean every tanker sails on time at normal cost? Does it mean warships can guarantee that no attack will ever occur? Does it mean markets return instantly to calm once escorts are visible? None of those things is guaranteed. A navy can reduce risk and preserve throughput. It cannot abolish uncertainty in a live contested theater. That means even a strong naval response can coexist with significant economic pain. This is why the phrase oil war can be both useful and misleading. It is useful because it captures the way a military contest in one narrow waterway can reach into fuel markets and domestic politics almost immediately. It is misleading if it suggests that the crisis must look like a classic war of tankers sunk in large numbers before the label applies. Modern chokepoint conflict can look more ambiguous than that. It can operate through a combination of threat, escort, air defense, cost inflation, and repeated incidents that keep the route functional but no longer normal. In practical terms, that is already a form of war pressure even when the legal or rhetorical labels stay contested. For allies, this ambiguity is particularly difficult. An Asian importer may believe the route is still technically open and still worry that its energy planning is becoming dangerously dependent on U.S. naval management. A European government may see no formal closure and still fear that any new incident will send another inflation wave into fragile domestic politics. Gulf partners may welcome American protection while also wondering how long Washington can or will sustain the burden if the crisis drags on. In each case, the route is usable, but usability itself has become a political variable. That political variable feeds back into force posture. The longer the crisis continues, the more U.S. commanders must think about not just immediate protection, but what prolonged protection does to readiness, maintenance, and strategic flexibility. Warships assigned to the Gulf are warships not available elsewhere. Aircraft devoted to route security are aircraft not training for some other contingency. Crews on prolonged high-alert experience a different kind of stress from crews in peacetime presence operations. None of this means the mission should not be done. It means the cost of doing it is cumulative. Navies dislike cumulative semi-war for good reason. A clean war has terrible stakes, but it usually clarifies priorities. Semi-war under chokepoint conditions is different. It asks forces to sustain high attention without a definitive endpoint. It mixes commercial reassurance with combat risk. It requires political calibration every day. And it often produces no dramatic victory moment that allows the mission to be declared complete. The best outcome may simply be that the route remains open enough and the market calms enough that catastrophe does not occur. That is a real achievement, but it is also a draining kind of achievement. This is where Washington's choices begin to narrow. If it does too little, the route may become progressively more expensive and uncertain. Allies may lose confidence, and domestic political pressure may rise as energy and freight costs spread. If it does more, it exposes more forces, normalizes more strikes, and increases the chance that the U.S. military becomes a central protagonist rather than a maritime stabilizer. The United States is therefore trapped between the cost of insufficiency and the cost of commitment. Hormuz is dangerous, precisely because both sides of that choice are expensive. For Iran, this narrowing of U.S. options is part of the leverage. A strategy of repeated pressure does not have to defeat the United States outright. It only has to push Washington into paying more and deciding under worse conditions. The actor applying pressure benefits if the defender is forced to commit more ships, more attention, and more political capital to preserving what had once seemed like routine commercial flow. In a region where asymmetry often matters more than symmetry, that is a meaningful kind of strategic gain. For Israel and the wider regional war system, the significance is different but connected. The less bounded the regional crisis feels, the more every maritime incident is interpreted in the context of wider escalation. A drone launch near Hormuz is no longer merely a local tactical event if Gaza is still expanding and Lebanon is still unstable. It becomes part of a larger argument about whether the Middle East is entering a broader phase of confrontation. That interpretation alone can move markets and political thresholds faster than the raw tactical facts might suggest. This is why Washington's ideal policy outcome is so hard to achieve. The ideal would be a route secure enough for markets, a regional war contained enough for diplomacy, and a military posture strong enough to deter without becoming the center of a larger confrontation. But these goals pull against each other. Stronger military response can help stabilize the route while widening the conflict story. Greater restraint can keep the story narrower while worsening market anxiety and allied concern. the choke point transforms what might have been separate policy choices into one interdependent problem. Another complicating factor is time horizon. Traders can reprice in minutes. Governments may need days or weeks to agree on a diplomatic line. Military deployments may take time to reposition even when large forces are already nearby. Public opinion can shift abruptly when fuel costs rise. Because those clocks move at different speeds, the crisis rarely waits for policy to become elegant. Markets move first, political pressure builds next, and long-term strategy often arrives later. That imbalance favors whoever is comfortable with friction and ambiguity. What would genuine restraint require under these conditions? It would require that the threat to shipping does not keep growing, that regional war fronts do not widen further, that commercial actors recover enough confidence to function without ever larger military management, and that domestic political costs remain tolerable long enough for diplomacy to work. That is a demanding list. None of those conditions is entirely in Washington's control. That is another way of saying the United States is constrained not just by its own choices, but by the structure of the crisis around it. The result is a form of strategic compulsion. America may still have agency. It may still choose between narrower and wider forms of involvement. But it is not choosing from a blank slate. It is choosing inside a system where energy dependence, alliance expectations, war risk pricing, deployed forces, and regional escalation are already pulling in the same direction. That does not make deeper involvement inevitable. It does mean that non-involvement becomes harder to sustain every time the route remains dangerous and the rest of the region remains unstable. Seen this way, Hormuz is not only a passage for oil, it is a passage through which unresolved regional conflict enters the decision-making of distant powers. The tankers are the visible part. Behind them are insurers, navies, traders, ministries, legislatures, voters, and commanders all reacting to the same narrow waterway. That is why the stakes keep expanding. The route is geographically small and strategically enormous. It can take a conflict that began as a regional war and make it feel like a test of world order, alliance reliability, and domestic economic endurance all at once. It also means that deeper involvement does not arrive in just one recognizable form. One version is administrative and maritime. The United States increases the density of escorts, surveillance, and route management without publicly redefining the crisis as a war. This looks limited, and in one sense it is. But it also commits more assets, more attention, and more prestige to the proposition that Washington can still impose enough order for commerce to continue. If the mission then fails visibly, the political cost is greater precisely because the commitment had already been increased. Another version is retaliatory and operational. The United States decides that preserving their route requires repeated action against the land-based systems making the sea route dangerous. Radar nodes, drone command links, launch points, and other enabling infrastructure become part of the target set. That may remain a narrower mission than general war, but it changes the logic of involvement. The United States is no longer only guarding traffic, it is actively degrading the military machinery of the state, applying pressure. That is a much more escalatory posture even when described in the language of self-defense. A third version is distributive. Washington tries to spread the burden through allied naval presence, partner coordination, and a broader coalition maritime security frame. On paper, this seems attractive. It shares visibility, and perhaps some of the operational load, but a choke point like Hormuz is not easily outsourced. The U.S. Navy still tends to be the central actor because it has the command infrastructure, sensor network, and political expectation attached to freedom of navigation missions at this scale. Coalition help can matter. It rarely erases the special burden of the leading power. There is also a version of deeper involvement that begins not with Washington's choice, but with the enemy's adaptation. If Iranian or proxy pressure becomes more sophisticated, more frequent, or more clearly coordinated across theaters, then simply holding the current line may require larger American effort, whether or not policymakers intended to cross into a new phase. That is another reason choke point crises are difficult. The defender's options are not defined only by its own preferences. They are shaped by how the coercer adapts to every defensive measure. This adaptation problem is especially serious in the age of cheap unmanned systems. If one pattern of launch or harassment becomes easier to counter, another can emerge. A strategy based on repeated pressure does not need to remain tactically identical to remain strategically effective. It only needs to keep the route uncomfortable enough and the defender busy enough that the burden of stabilization stays high. That forces the defending power into continuous learning, continuous presence, and continuous political exposure. What would de-escalation require in such an environment? Not merely one successful intercept or one warning statement. It would require a restoration of commercial confidence, a reduction in launch risk, some meaningful stabilization of the wider regional war fronts, and enough predictability that the route could again operate more on commercial assumptions than on emergency naval management. That is a tall order. It demands progress not only at sea, but in the political conflicts feeding the maritime risk in the first place. This is why Washington's position is so uncomfortable. If it acts too narrowly, it may preserve neither the market's confidence nor its own credibility. If it acts too broadly, it risks helping to create the larger war it wants to avoid. That is not a rhetorical trap. It is a real strategic problem caused by the convergence of oil routes, active fronts, allied dependence, and deployed forces. A route like Hormuz does not allow elegant separation between economic stability and military risk. The two sit on top of each other. It is also why public debate can become confused. Some observers will see every convoy mission as proof that a major war is already underway. Others will see every successful transit as proof that the danger is exaggerated. Both views miss the harder reality. The crisis can be severe without total closure, and the route can remain usable without being truly safe. The most difficult strategic situations often live in that middle ground, where normal life continues just enough to obscure how much effort is required to keep it from collapsing. For the United States, then, the key question is not whether it can imagine a world in which it would rather stay out. Of course it can. The key question is whether the structure of the Hormuz crisis leaves that preference operationally sustainable. If allies remain dependent, if markets remain fragile, if the route remains threatened, and if U.S. ships are already the backbone of route protection, then the margin for stepping back shrinks sharply. That is what the chokepoint does. It compresses strategic distance until preference itself begins to lose power. By the time leaders are publicly debating whether America is being dragged deeper in, the route has usually already pulled part of the system with it. Prices have moved. Naval forces have moved. Political attention has moved. The question then becomes less about initial involvement and more about how to keep limited involvement from becoming something broader. That is the final danger of Hormuz. It is not just that it can be threatened, it is that threatening. It creates pressure in too many places at once for major powers to ignore for very long. From there, the final question follows naturally. Could the United States be pulled in deeper? Not in the rhetorical sense where every crisis is described as the eve of total war, but in the practical sense that matters to planners and voters. What are the actual escalation paths from the situation that exists now? The first path is expansion of the escort and protection mission. If commercial confidence continues to erode, Washington could decide that more visible and more regular convoy-style protection is necessary. That does not require a formal declaration of wider war. It only requires the judgment that current measures are no longer enough to keep commerce moving with acceptable confidence. But every expansion of escort duties increases exposure, ties down more ships, and creates more opportunities for confrontation. An expanded escort regime would change the feel of the route even if officials continued to speak cautiously. Commercial transit would begin to depend more visibly on military choreography. Tankers would move not simply because the market expected passage, but because a defending navy had arranged the conditions under which passage seemed tolerable. That is a major strategic shift. It means the route is still open, but it is open through managed protection rather than through ordinary confidence. Such a regime would also be harder to sustain than many headlines suggest. Escort is not only the visible ship beside the tanker, it is the air picture behind it, the intelligence assessment ahead of it, the logistics cycle under it, and the maintenance schedule following it. If more and more commercial movement begins to rely on this kind of protection, then the United States is effectively underwriting not just security, but normality itself. That underwriting can calm the market for a time, but it also binds the protecting power more tightly to the route's daily functioning. The second path is further strikes on launch and control networks. If drones and missiles continue to threaten shipping, then defensive interception alone may be judged insufficient. More strikes like those reported on May 31st against radar and drone command and control sites could follow. Those strikes may be framed as self-defense or route protection, but they still widen the operational confrontation between the United States and Iran. Each new strike increases the chance of retaliation somewhere else, whether it's sea, through proxies, or against regional bases. There is a logic to that path. A route that must be defended only at the last second is a route that remains permanently expensive and fragile. If commanders believe the threat chain can be disrupted more effectively ashore, then pressure will grow to keep striking nodes rather than waiting for each launch to mature. But that logic is dangerous precisely because it is operationally reasonable. Reasonable military logic can still produce a much broader political confrontation when repeated often enough. The third path is regional widening through Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon. If the war in Gaza intensifies further, if the northern front with Hezbollah deteriorates, or if ceasefire efforts around Lebanon fail decisively, then the broader environment around Hormuz becomes more volatile. Maritime pressure might increase, not because the strait itself changed, but because the regional conflict system grew more dangerous overall. In such a scenario, U.S. naval protection missions could become only one part of a much wider force posture problem. The fourth path is direct attack on U.S. ships or bases that causes casualties significant enough to alter political thresholds. That is the path every government fears most because it can force rapid decisions under public pressure. A maritime confrontation that damages a U.S. destroyer, kills American personnel, or produces a spectacular attack on commercial shipping under U.S. protection would transform the policy debate overnight. At that point, the argument would no longer be about abstract regional risk. It would be about direct response. And even before that threshold, there is a quieter form of deepening that matters. The route can become so dependent on constant protection and constant policy attention that Washington is effectively living inside the crisis even without one dramatic tipping point. More meetings, more alerts, more surveillance, more public reassurance, more allied coordination, and more limited retaliation can together create a strategic condition in which the United States is already more involved than its official rhetoric might admit. That kind of gradual involvement often matters more than one headline, because it can persist for months. This is one reason crises like Hormuz are so difficult to conclude cleanly. A dramatic event can start them, but a long sequence of partial burdens can sustain them. Ships keep sailing, so policymakers tell themselves the situation is still manageable. Markets keep reacting, so they also know the situation is not really normal. That tension between functionality and fragility is exactly where deeper involvement grows. It does not always arrive with a declaration. Sometimes it arrives as the slow normalization of extraordinary effort. Yet there is a paradox here. Washington may believe that by staying present, escorting traffic, and responding to threats, it is preventing a larger war. That may be true. But the same presence also guarantees that the United States remains physically inside the escalation environment. It cannot stabilize the choke point from a distance. It stabilizes it by putting ships, aircraft, and people in the path of danger. In other words, the very policy designed to avoid wider war can become the mechanism by which the United States is most exposed to it. This is why the crisis cannot be reduced to a single question like, will Iran close Hormuz? That is too narrow. The real question is how much disorder, fear, and forced protection burden can accumulate before Washington is compelled to do more than it is doing now. A formal closure is only one possible trigger. A series of drone attacks, a rise in tanker losses or delays, a collapse of diplomatic containment in Lebanon, or a major shock to energy markets could all create pressure for deeper involvement even without one decisive cinematic event. Another way to say this is that the crisis operates through accumulation rather than theatrical clarity. The route can remain open enough for commerce to limp through and still be dangerous enough to change global politics. That middle condition is exactly what makes Hormuz so consequential. If the strait were fully closed, the policy answer might become more brutally obvious. If the strait were fully calm, the problem would disappear. But a route that stays usable only through expensive military management, rising insurance, repeated alerts, and nervous diplomacy creates the hardest strategic problem of all. It keeps asking more from the United States without offering the clean logic of either peace or open war. That is also why so many officials keep returning to the language of normalization. What everyone wants is not merely movement, but normal movement. Not just transit, but transit that does not require crisis management. Not just lower prices for a week, but a route that no longer forces military planners, energy ministries, and insurers to behave as though the next incident is always close. Until that kind of normality returns, the United States remains tied to the crisis whether or not leaders would prefer to describe the mission in narrower terms. And that may be the most important point of all. In Hormuz, involvement is not measured only by whether Washington declares a bigger war. It is measured by how much American power must be spent to keep abnormal conditions from becoming the new normal. If destroyers, aircraft, markets, allies, and domestic politics all remain locked onto the same narrow route, then the crisis has already achieved one of its main strategic effects. It has made distance irrelevant and forced the United States to keep paying attention. That is why the route remains so politically dangerous even when shipping continues. Continuity can hide the burden. Tankers still move, so some observers assume the system is stable. But if that continuity depends on repeated escorts, repeated intercepts, repeated market reassurance, and repeated fears about the next attack, then the system is being held together by extraordinary effort. Extraordinary effort can succeed for a while. It is still not normality. And because it is not normality, every actor in the system keeps asking the same question in a different language. Traders ask how long the route can stay reliable. Sailors ask how long the pace can stay sustainable. Politicians ask how long voters will tolerate the cost. Allies ask how long Washington will remain committed. Those questions are different on the surface, but they all point back to the same narrow waterway. That shared pressure is what gives Hormuz its strategic gravity, and it is why no serious maritime power can dismiss the route lightly. Each of those paths deepens U.S. involvement differently. A larger escort mission is still a protection mission, but it binds more assets to the route and increases the chance of encounter. A campaign of strikes against launch and control networks remains narrower than full war, but it still moves the United States further into direct confrontation with Iranian military infrastructure. A wider Israel-Hezbollah conflict multiplies the number of fronts from which pressure can spread, and a major successful attack on U.S. ships, bases, or protected commercial traffic could compress decision time so severely that Washington is forced into a much sharper response than it originally intended. That is why the crisis feels structurally dangerous even before any final threshold is crossed. The route matters too much, the threat tools are too repeatable, and the political consequences of inaction are too visible. In that environment, the United States is not choosing between total detachment and total war. It is navigating a ladder of partial commitments that can become deeper commitments if enough smaller pressures accumulate, and this is where the title's central warning becomes clear. The 21-mile Chokepoint matters not because it guarantees war, but because it reduces the room to ignore one. It ties together energy dependence, naval commitments, regional alliances, and the vulnerability of highly visible shipping routes. It takes a crisis that might otherwise remain a matter of speeches, and turns it into something that can reach American consumers, American warships, and American political choices all at once. The United States may want limits. It may want to protect shipping without owning the whole crisis. It may want to support allies without sliding into another open-ended conflict. It may want to keep markets calm without enlarging the battlefield. But the Strait does not care about those preferences. It only presents the strategic fact that a huge share of traded energy still moves through one narrow route, and that route is now contested by a state using pressure tactics that are cheap enough to repeat and dangerous enough to matter. So the final answer is not that America is doomed to a new oil war, and it is not that the crisis can be safely dismissed as someone else's problem. The answer is more uncomfortable. Washington may not have full freedom of choice here when oil routes, deployed forces, regional war fronts, and alliance expectations all converge in one narrow waterway. The question is no longer whether America wants to be involved. The question is whether the structure of the crisis gives it any realistic way not to be. There is one more way to understand why this crisis is so hard to end. The world does not need the Strait of Hormuz to become permanently closed for the damage to become real. It only needs enough uncertainty that normal commercial assumptions begin to break down. A tanker captain does not need proof of a full naval war to worry about the next transit. An insurer does not need proof of a permanent blockade to raise risk estimates. An energy trader does not need proof of a shutdown to price fear into the market. A government does not need proof of catastrophe to start preparing for one. That is the gap Iran can exploit, and the gap the United States has to manage. It is the space between peace and closure, between normal trade and open war, between a warning shot and a strategic crisis. In that space, small actions can create large reactions because the route is already so important. A drone that never reaches its target can still affect decisions if it proves the route is being watched and threatened. A mine threat that never becomes a confirmed minefield can still slow planning if no one wants to be the first ship to test the assumption. A missile battery that never fires can still shape behavior if commanders believe it could fire under the wrong conditions. For Washington, this creates a problem of credibility. If the United States promises freedom of navigation, then repeated disruption challenges not only the flow of oil, but the meaning of that promise. If it responds too softly, adversaries may conclude that pressure works. If it responds too sharply, the confrontation can move from maritime protection into a larger military contest. The route therefore forces American leaders to defend two things at the same time: the physical movement of ships and the political belief that the sea lane remains governable. That belief is not a small matter. Modern trade depends on confidence. Ships are steel, engines, crews, cargo, and schedules. But global trade is also a chain of expectations. People expect contracts to be honored, ports to function, insurance to be available, crews to be willing, and military risk to remain bounded. When a choke point becomes contested, that chain of expectations weakens. Even if the ships keep moving, every voyage becomes more expensive in planning, more nervous in execution, and more politically visible. The danger for the United States is that protecting confidence can become more demanding than protecting any single vessel. A single tanker can be escorted, a single drone can be intercepted, a single warning can be answered, but confidence is a wider system. It requires repetition. It requires the sense that protection will be there not once, but consistently. It requires allies and markets to believe the United States will not disappear after the first difficult week. That is how a limited mission expands, without anyone having to announce a dramatic expansion. The standard rises from preventing disaster to sustaining confidence. This is also why the cost of inaction is not purely military. If the route looks unstable, the political effects can appear at home. American voters may not follow every naval statement or every tanker alert, but they do understand fuel prices, grocery prices, interest rates, and headlines about another Middle East crisis. A disruption thousands of miles away can become part of a domestic argument about inflation, leadership, and whether the country is being pulled back into a region many Americans hope to think about less. In that sense, the choke point can enter American politics long before a single American voter could point to it on a map. The same is true for allies. Gulf states want protection but do not want uncontrolled escalation on their doorstep. European and Asian importers want reliable energy flows, but may not want to carry the same military burden. Israel watches Iran through the lens of its own security and the war around Gaza and Lebanon. Iran watches American deployments for signs of both weakness and overreach. Each actor sees the same waterway through a different fear. That makes coordination harder because every move meant to reassure one audience can alarm another. A larger U.S. naval posture may reassure shippers and Gulf partners. but it may also signal to Iran that a bigger confrontation is approaching. A restrained U.S. posture may reduce the appearance of escalation, but it may also worry allies and markets that Washington is tolerating too much pressure. A coalition mission may spread legitimacy, but if the United States remains the backbone of command and capability, the political burden still returns to Washington. The choke point turns every option into a trade-off. There is a deeper historical lesson here as well. Maritime choke points become dangerous when they compress military risk and economic necessity into one place. They do not have to be large to matter. In fact, their smallness is part of their power. A narrow route reduces maneuver space. It concentrates traffic. It gives weaker actors a way to threaten stronger systems. It allows limited tools to produce global effects. That is why the map is misleading if it makes Hormuz look like a small local passage. Strategically, it is closer to a pressure valve for the world economy. And the pressure is not only about oil barrels, it is about the kind of world system those barrels support. Energy moves through Hormuz into refineries, ports, factories, power grids, shipping networks, and political budgets. When that movement becomes uncertain, the anxiety spreads outward through systems that rarely appear in war footage. The crisis becomes visible as a warship at sea, but it is also present in insurance documents, central bank calculations, airline fuel costs, government emergency meetings, and the quiet decisions companies make about whether to reroute, delay, or pay more. That is why a clean ending is so difficult. A ceasefire in one theater may help, but it may not restore confidence at sea if the maritime threat remains. A successful naval intercept may help, but it may not calm the region if the Gaza war and Lebanon front keep widening the strategic story. A diplomatic statement may help, but it may not lower insurance if commercial actors believe the threat tools are still in place. The crisis is connected across domains, and connected crises rarely end with one clean move. The best case is not glamorous. It is not a decisive battle or a dramatic surrender. The best case is a gradual return to boring maritime routine. Fewer alerts, fewer emergency deployments, fewer armed escorts needed to reassure traffic, lower insurance pressure, less political heat, more predictable regional diplomacy. In other words, success would look like the route becoming less interesting. That is often the paradox of maritime security. When it works, the world stops paying attention. When it fails, everyone suddenly discovers how much depended on it. But getting back to boring is hard because the tools of disruption are now cheaper, more distributed, and more politically useful than they used to be. A weaker actor does not need to build a navy equal to the U.S. Navy to make the route feel dangerous. It can use drones, missiles, mines, surveillance, proxies, warnings, and calibrated uncertainty. The United States can still bring overwhelming force to the region, but overwhelming force does not automatically restore normality if the adversary's objective is to keep uncertainty alive rather than win a conventional sea battle. That is the uncomfortable asymmetry at the center of the crisis. The United States is trying to preserve a system. Iran can profit by stressing it. Preserving a system requires endurance, restraint, precision, and credibility across time. Stressing it may require only recurring friction and the credible possibility of worse. That does not mean Iran controls the outcome. It does mean the burden of stabilization is heavier than the burden of disruption. So when people ask whether America could be dragged into an oil war, the answer depends on what they mean by dragged. If they mean a sudden, inevitable march into a massive declared war, that is not the only or even the most likely path. But if they mean a steady movement into deeper naval commitments, more strikes, more force protection, more economic pressure, and more political exposure, then the danger is real. The route can pull America deeper one obligation at a time. That is why the Strait of Hormuz remains the central character in this story. Gaza matters. Lebanon matters. Iran matters. Iran matters. Drones and missiles matter. Oil markets matter. But Hormuz is where those separate pressures can combine into one unavoidable strategic question. How much risk can the world tolerate in the route that carries so much of its energy, and who will pay the price to keep that risk from becoming a shock? For now, the answer still points back to the United States. Not because Washington controls every cause of the crisis, and not because it wants another open-ended conflict, but because its ships, alliances, bases, and economic interests are already tied to the route. That is what makes the 21-mile choke point so powerful. It does not need to choose America's policy. It only needs to narrow America's choices. And once the choices narrow, every transit becomes more than a commercial movement. Every tanker becomes a test of deterrence. Every drone becomes a test of response. Every market spike becomes a test of political endurance. Every diplomatic failure elsewhere in the region becomes another reason the sea lane feels less stable. That is the mechanism by which a regional crisis becomes an American crisis. So the final warning is simple. The Strait of Hormuz does not have to close to change the world. It only has to become uncertain enough, dangerous enough, and politically important enough that the United States feels compelled to keep stepping closer. That is how a narrow waterway becomes a global problem. That is how an oil route becomes a war risk. And that is how a crisis America would rather contain can still pull America toward the center of it. This is the part of the story that matters after the headlines fade. If the route remains tense for weeks or months, the crisis stops looking like a single emergency and starts becoming a new operating condition. Naval planners build schedules around it. Gulf governments build diplomacy around it. Energy markets build risk premiums around it. American officials build talking points around it. What began as an acute shock can settle into a chronic burden, and chronic burdens are often how great powers become committed more deeply than they first intended. That slow commitment is easy to underestimate because no one day seems decisive. One day brings an alert. Another brings an intercept. Another brings a diplomatic call. Another brings a warning to shipping. Another brings a deployment adjustment. None of those moments alone has to be called an oil war, but taken together, they can create a posture in which the United States is continuously managing a contested energy corridor while the surrounding regional conflicts remain unresolved. That is a serious strategic condition, even if the vocabulary stays cautious. It also creates a fatigue problem. Crews, commanders, diplomats, and markets can absorb high tension for a while. But sustaining alertness has costs. Warships need maintenance. Sailors need rotation. Intelligence systems need constant attention. Allies need repeated reassurance. Commercial operators need updated guidance. Political leaders need to explain why a faraway waterway keeps demanding American focus. Over time, the question is not only whether the United States has the capability, it is whether the mission remains politically and operationally sustainable if the crisis refuses to resolve. Iran understands that endurance is part of the contest. A coercive strategy does not need to produce immediate victory if it can impose recurring cost. The United States understands the opposite side of the same equation. If it cannot sustain the route's credibility, then a central promise of American maritime power looks weaker. That is why even limited incidents can carry strategic weight. They are not judged only by physical damage. They are judged by what they suggest about persistence, resolve, and the future cost of keeping the route open. The most dangerous moment may therefore be the moment when everyone becomes used to the tension. If abnormal conditions start to feel normal, the region can drift into a pattern where military presence is constant, commercial anxiety is permanent, and escalation risk is always one mistake away. That is not peace. It is a managed crisis. Managed crises can last, but they can also break suddenly when a weapon misses. A commander misreads an action, a proxy overreaches, or a domestic political threshold is crossed. That is the final reason Hormuz cannot be separated from the rest of the Middle East crisis. The waterway is not floating outside politics. It sits beside Iran, near Gulf energy infrastructure, inside the range of military systems, and within a region already shaped by the wars and confrontations around Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the Red Sea. Pressure in one place changes calculations in another. The sea route becomes the place where those calculations can touch the global economy most directly. So if there is a lesson for viewers in America, it is not that every crisis must become an American war. It is that some geography gives distant crises a direct path into American life. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. Its width is measured in miles, but its consequences are measured in fuel prices, naval deployments, alliance credibility, and the political limits of restraint. That is why this narrow channel keeps returning to the center of global strategy. And if there is a lesson for policymakers, it is that keeping the route open is not the same as solving the crisis. Openness is necessary, but it is not enough. The deeper objective is restoring enough predictability that oil, shipping, and diplomacy no longer depend on constant crisis management. Until that happens, the United States remains involved not because it necessarily wants escalation, but because the cost of looking away remains too high.